Story number 1.
The car sputtered to a stop just as the last traces of sunlight dipped below the horizon. Emma groaned, slamming her palm against the steering wheel. She was on her way to a friend's cabin for the weekend, but her GPS had rerouted her after an accident on the highway. Now she was stranded on a desolate stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but fields and forest. "Perfect," she muttered, pulling out her phone. Of course, there was no signal. She stepped out into the cool evening air and looked around. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Emma grabbed a flashlight from the trunk, its beam slicing through the growing darkness, and started walking. There had to be a house or gas station somewhere. As she trudged down the road, an eerie feeling crept over her. The landscape felt unnatural, too still. The wind carried a faint, metallic smell, sharp enough to sting her nostrils. Emma tried to shake it off, focusing on the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. After about 15 minutes, she spotted a faint light flickering in the distance. Relief washed over her as she hurried toward it, the outline of an old farmhouse materializing in the dim light. The house looked weathered, its paint peeling, windows dark except for the single flickering bulb on the porch. She hesitated, but figured she had no choice. Climbing the creaking wooden steps, Emma knocked on the door. It echoed through the house, a hollow, unsettling sound. She waited, then knocked again. The door creaked open on its own. "Hello?" Emma called out, shining her flashlight into the entryway. Dust motes floated in the beam, and the air inside was thick and heavy. She stepped in cautiously, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. The house smelled faintly of mildew and something sweeter, almost like decaying fruit. The furniture was old, covered in sheets, and the wallpaper hung in tatters. "Anyone home?" she asked again, her voice trembling. As she moved further into the house, she heard it, a faint, shuffling sound coming from upstairs. Emma froze. "Hello," she called out, her voice cracking. The shuffling stopped. She should have left. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to turn around and run, but something kept her rooted in place. Curiosity? Fear? She wasn't sure. "Are you okay up there?" She ventured, her flashlight trembling in her hand. No response. Emma took a tentative step toward the staircase. The wooden steps groaned under her weight as she ascended, her heart pounding in her chest. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors. The shuffling started again, louder this time, coming from the last door on the left. She approached it slowly, her breath shallow. The doorknob was cold under her palm as she turned it. The door creaked open to reveal a bedroom, its furniture shrouded in white sheets like the rest of the house. But what caught her attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was massive, its ornate frame tarnished with age. The glass, however, was impossibly clean, reflecting her pale, wide-eyed face. As she stepped closer, something shifted in the reflection. It wasn't her. A woman stood behind her in the mirror, her face gaunt and hollow, eyes sunken and dark. Her lips moved, forming silent words. Emma spun around, but no one was there. She turned back to the mirror. The woman was closer now, her bony hand reaching out, her mouth opening in a soundless scream. Emma stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, but the scream continued, no longer soundless. It filled the air, high-pitched and piercing, like nails on a chalkboard. Emma covered her ears and scrambled out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. She barreled down the stairs and toward the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Her flashlight flickered on the floor where she'd dropped it, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The scream grew louder, reverberating through the house. "Let me out!" Emma screamed, pounding on the door. The screaming stopped. The silence was worse. Emma turned, her back pressed against the door, her chest heaving. The flashlight flickered one last time and went out completely. In the pitch-black darkness, she heard it. The shuffling, now coming from all around her. Her breath hitched as a hand brushed against her arm. She yelped, swatting at the air, but there was nothing there. The metallic smell grew stronger, choking her. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the center of the room. It hovered there, pulsing faintly, illuminating the figure of the woman from the mirror. She stood motionless, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes boring into Emma's. "Why?" the woman rasped, her voice low and guttural. Emma couldn't move, couldn't speak. "Why did you leave me?" the woman hissed, her face contorting with rage. She stepped closer, her feet dragging across the floor. I didn't, Emma stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman stopped inches away, her icy breath brushing against Emma's face. You will never leave, she growled, her bony fingers wrapping around Emma's wrist. The room spun, the walls melting into darkness. Emma felt herself falling, her screams swallowed by the void. When she woke up, she was back in her car. The engine was running and the sun was just beginning to rise. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind reeling. It had to have been a dream. But as she looked in the rearview mirror, she froze. In the back seat, faint but unmistakable, was the reflection of a gaunt, hollow-eyed woman staring back at her. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was a Friday evening when I found myself driving through the middle of nowhere, heading toward a small remote cabin my friend rented for a weekend getaway. I'd been looking forward to some peace and quiet for weeks, but I didn't realize how isolated it would feel once I was actually there. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and I was now on a winding dirt road that seemed to stretch on forever. My phone had no signal, and the GPS kept freezing. I could barely see anything beyond the faint glow of my headlights. The trees seemed to press in on either side, the road narrowing as the fog started to roll in. I had been driving for over an hour, and nothing had changed. No other cars, no houses, not even the sound of wildlife. Just the low hum of the engine and the sound of gravel crunching beneath my tires. I was starting to wonder if I had somehow taken a wrong turn, but there were no signs, no markers, just endless trees and darkness. After what felt like an eternity, I rounded a corner, and the headlights briefly illuminated a figure by the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart jumping into my throat. There was a man standing completely still. He wasn't walking or even moving his head, just standing there, looking out into the woods. I hesitated. It didn't make sense for someone to be out here. No one would be walking on a road this far from civilization at this hour. But after a moment, I figured he might need help. I rolled down my window just a crack and called out to him. "Hey, are you all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't respond. His posture was unnervingly stiff. It was as though he hadn't heard me. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but there was something off about his whole appearance. I felt my stomach churn. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time, but he still didn't react. I shifted the car into drive, ready to pull away when something strange happened. For just a split second, I thought I saw his head turn, but it wasn't the movement of a person. It was like his whole body rotated at once, unnaturally fast. Then he was gone. I quickly drove away, my heart pounding. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd been on the road too long, and the isolation was starting to get to me. But as I continued on, the eerie feeling didn't go away. It only intensified. The road seemed to stretch out further and further, but the trees and fog never relented. There were no signs of life, no cabins, no lights, nothing. Just the soft, rhythmic sound of my car engine and the occasional creak of the tires over gravel. I must have driven another 15 minutes when I noticed it. In my rearview mirror, there was a faint silhouette. Someone was walking behind me. The same figure. The man I had just seen. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way. I hadn't passed him. I hadn't seen anyone else on the road. I glanced in the mirror again. The silhouette was still there, growing closer, but it didn't move like a person. It was like he was gliding over the road, too smooth, too fluid to be human. Panic flooded my chest. I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel as if it could somehow make the car go faster. But the figure kept pace with me, its shape never wavering, always just behind the car, as though it were following me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. I pushed the pedal to the floor, my car speeding down the winding road as the figure in the rearview mirror remained there, never closer, but never farther away. And then I saw it. A sign for a small town up ahead, only a few miles away. I exhaled, my whole body sagging with relief. The town, the safety of other people, I could make it. But just as I took the turn toward the town, something strange happened. The figure wasn't in the mirror anymore. I should have been relieved, but that strange sense of dread deepened. I glanced around, but there was nothing. The fog had swallowed the road behind me, and the trees were silent. For a moment, I considered stopping, getting out of the car to see if I could find anything, but the thought of stepping outside into the cold, dark silence made my skin crawl. The town was just a mile away now, or so I thought, but as I drove, I saw nothing but the endless trees and fog. The road had taken on an otherworldly quality, the lights of the town nowhere to be seen. The sign I had seen earlier pointing to the town was gone too. I was still on the same desolate road, the same stretch of nothingness, and I realized with a start that I had been driving for far longer than I should have. I was lost. I tried to turn around, but the road was too narrow. I couldn't risk backing up too fast. There was no telling how far I'd gone or if I might drive straight into a ditch. My stomach twisted in fear as I stared at the black void in front of me. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, the car shuddered, and the engine sputtered. I gripped the wheel as the car began to slow down. The hum of the engine died, and I was plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence. The car came to a stop. I sat there, staring ahead, frozen in place. What was happening? How had everything gone so wrong? The fog surrounded me completely now. The trees too close on either side, the road too narrow. I tried starting the car again, but the engine refused to turn over. My phone had no signal, and I was completely alone in the dark. There were no houses, no cars, no lights anywhere. Then, a faint noise broke the silence, a scraping sound, as though something was dragging along the gravel. I looked out of the window, but all I could see was the thick fog. The noise came closer, and then there was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. I leaned forward, my breath caught in my throat, and then I saw it. The figure was standing just a few feet away from my car, his face still hidden beneath the hood, but now he was closer than ever before. I wanted to scream, to get out and run, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in place. The man raised his head slowly. For the first time, I could see his face. His features were pale, sunken, with dark circles around his eyes. His skin was ashy, like it hadn't been touched by the sun in years. But what struck me most were his eyes, black, void of any color, any light. There was nothing there but emptiness. I couldn't breathe. My hand fumbled for the door handle, but I was too slow. The man reached out to the car door, his hand coming into view. It was long, too long, his fingers unnaturally thin, his nails sharp like claws. The scraping sound returned, and the hand pressed against the window. My chest felt like it was collapsing. The cold that swept through the car felt like it was reaching into my bones. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was his mouth opening, a horrible, gaping grin stretching far too wide, too unnatural. When I woke up, the fog had lifted. I was in the same spot on the side of the road, but the car had started again. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the man was gone. I didn't stay long. I didn't know what had happened or how I managed to leave, but I could feel something in the air, something heavy, like I had narrowly escaped something much darker than I could understand. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of the sign, Hollow Pine Cemetery, again, just for a moment, before the road twisted and disappeared behind me. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. Just me, the car, and the open road. I'd heard about a small cabin in the woods, isolated far from civilization, offered for rent on one of those cabin rental websites. I'd been burnt out from work, so I thought a few days of solitude would be just what I needed to recharge. No cell service, no distractions, just the stillness of nature. The drive was long and winding, taking me further and further away from any recognizable landmarks. The roads became narrower, the trees growing denser on either side, and the phone's GPS signal faded out. I didn't mind. I trusted the directions that had been emailed to me. It felt peaceful at first, the sound of the tires crunching on gravel, the hum of the engine, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you can hear your own thoughts clearly. As the sun began to set, the shadows in the woods grew longer, stretching across the road like dark fingers. I pushed on, determined to get to the cabin before nightfall. But as the minutes passed, a strange unease settled over me. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing in from all sides. The further I drove, the more the feeling grew. I passed a few old barns and rusted farm equipment on the side of the road, but they were all abandoned, their windows boarded up. No signs of life. The only thing that broke the monotony was a dilapidated old gas station, long since closed, with peeling paint and weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. The entire place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I glanced at the clock. It was getting late, way later than I had intended. I decided to pull over and take a break, hoping to shake off the strange feeling that had started to gnaw at me. I parked on the shoulder, stepped out of the car, and stretched my legs. The cool evening air felt good, though there was something about it that felt unnatural. A quiet that was too deep, too still. As I stood there, taking in the scenery, I heard something, a faint rustling coming from the woods to my right. I turned, expecting to see a deer or some small animal, but there was nothing. The trees stood still, their branches barely moving in the breeze. I shook my head and told myself it was nothing. Just the wind, I thought. But then I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was a person, someone walking along the road, but as I looked closer, I realized it was standing just outside the tree line, barely visible in the gathering dark. It was a man, but he didn't move, just standing there, motionless. He was dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothes, a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. The way he stood there, perfectly still, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I called out, "Hey, are you all right?" No answer. He didn't move. I felt a surge of nervous energy, but I didn't want to appear scared. I tried again. "Hey, are you lost? Do you need help?" Still nothing. I considered walking over to him, but something stopped me. There was an instinctual pull in the pit of my stomach, telling me to get back in the car. Something was wrong. I didn't wait around to figure out what. I climbed back into the car quickly, locking the door. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The man hadn't moved, still standing there, staring at the ground. But the moment I began to drive away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was gone. I didn't breathe easy until I was well past the gas station, the sight of the man disappearing from my view. But that feeling of unease still lingered, following me like a shadow. I pressed on, telling myself it was nothing more than my imagination running wild. The road twisted and turned through the dense woods, each bend more unsettling than the last. The trees seemed to close in on the road, the shadows growing deeper, more oppressive. The headlights of my car barely cut through the thick darkness. It was the kind of isolation that made you feel like the world had disappeared entirely. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the cabin. It was tucked back in the woods, just as promised, and it looked charming in the dim light. The small log cabin was surrounded by trees, the front porch lit by a single lamp, a perfect little haven away from everything. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and walked up the wooden steps, the creak of the boards under my feet, the only sound. The key was waiting for me under the mat, and I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air inside smelled like old wood and dust. It was cozy, but there was something off about it. The silence was overwhelming. I shook it off. It was just the stillness of being so far from civilization, I told myself. I dropped my bags, made myself a cup of tea, and settled into a chair by the window, looking out at the dark forest surrounding the cabin. There was no one around for miles. That's when I heard the knocking. It was faint at first, just a soft tap against the window. I thought maybe it was the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. I stood up, heart pounding. I walked over to the window, my breath fogging the glass. I couldn't see anything in the dark, just the outline of the trees. No movement, no figure. But the knocking continued. It was coming from the window behind me now, not the one I was standing in front of. I spun around, but again, nothing. The air around me felt thick, like it was pressing in, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the door creaked open. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone approach. I hadn't even heard the footsteps. The door was ajar, just enough for a person to slip inside. I backed up slowly, heart racing. The door slowly pushed further open, and I could hear the soft rustling of something moving just outside. Then the voice came. "You shouldn't be here." It was low, almost a whisper, but it felt like it was coming from right behind me. I whipped around. There was no one there. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was dead. I fumbled with the door, desperate to leave, but it wouldn't budge. The door that had been wide open moments ago was now locked from the outside. The knocking continued, louder now, all around me, but it wasn't the window. It was the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Like something, or someone was inside the cabin with me. My breath came in short gasps as I backed into the corner of the room, my eyes darting to every shadow in the dark cabin. The voice came again. "You shouldn't be here." This time it was closer. So close I could feel the cold breath on the back of my neck. I don't know how long I stayed like that, terrified, until I finally managed to wrench the door open. I ran through the dark woods, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks, my breath ragged in the cold night air. I didn't stop until I reached the car. I didn't look back. When I got back to the main road, I didn't even check to see if the cabin was still there. I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. I never went back to that place. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was real or if my mind just snapped from the isolation. But I can never forget the voice, the knocking, the sense that something was waiting for me, just outside of the light. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I had been driving for hours, hoping to reach my destination before nightfall. I was headed to a remote cabin in the mountains, the kind of place where the only sounds are the rustling of the trees and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, peaceful, quiet, and away from the distractions of the city. The GPS had been unreliable for most of the drive. I'd passed through small towns, and now the road had turned into a winding dirt path. The trees on both sides were so dense that they almost swallowed the road, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. It was the middle of nowhere, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I started to realize just how isolated I really was. At first, I didn't mind the silence. I rolled down the windows to feel the cool breeze and let the natural surroundings calm me. But as the last slivers of sunlight faded, a strange unease began to settle over me. It was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That's when I saw the figure. It appeared on the side of the road, standing motionless in the growing darkness. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as I got closer, I could see that it was a person. A man, dressed in a faded brown jacket and jeans, his hands hanging by his sides. His face was obscured by the dim light, but there was something about his posture that unsettled me. He didn't seem to be moving at all, just standing there, staring ahead. I slowed the car down as I approached, unsure of what to do. I figured he might need help, so I rolled the window down just a crack and called out to him. "Hey, are you all right?" I asked. No response. I called again, louder this time. "Do you need help?" Still, nothing. He didn't even turn his head. His body was rigid, and his eyes seemed locked on some distant point. A strange chill washed over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The road was narrow, and there was nowhere to turn around, so I decided to keep driving. I gently pressed the gas pedal, but as I passed him, something strange happened. I caught a glimpse of his face, or rather, what should have been his face. It was pale, smooth, featureless, a blank canvas where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. I jerked the wheel to the side and nearly swerved off the road. My heart was racing now, and I forced myself to keep my focus on the road ahead. The headlights illuminated the winding path, and the trees seemed to close in tighter. The unsettling sensation that had been growing inside me now felt like a full-blown panic. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe I was overtired, maybe I was imagining things, but that didn't explain the feeling of being watched. It lingered, like a weight pressing down on my chest. As I drove deeper into the woods, the fog began to roll in, thick and suffocating. The air grew damp, and my headlights barely cut through the swirling mist. The road ahead was barely visible, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong, Mondis, that I wasn't alone. I drove on trying to stay calm, but I couldn't stop glancing nervously at the darkened forest on either side. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And then I saw it again. A figure standing in the middle of the road. This time, I didn't hesitate. I slammed on the brakes, my hands shaking as I tried to stop the car in time. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there directly in my path. I rolled down the window, half expecting him to approach the car. "Hey, what the hell are you doing? Get out of the road!" There was no response. My pulse raced and my mouth went dry. I glanced at the road behind me, but it was empty. No sign of anyone, nothing but the thick fog and the quiet hum of my car. I honked the horn, pressing it several times, but the figure remained still. I was about to drive around him when something stopped me. His face. This time, I saw it more clearly. It was that same featureless face, like a blank canvas, the skin pale and stretched tight. But his eyes, they were there now. Empty, black voids, hollow, soulless pits staring right into me. I slammed the car into reverse, but the figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching. My hands were clammy as I tried to shift into drive again. The car sputtered, but wouldn't start. Panic surged within me. I tried again. Nothing. The car refused to start. The figure began moving toward the car, his feet dragging, the sound of each step unnatural. The way he walked, slow, deliberate, felt wrong, like he was gliding rather than walking. His body swayed with each step, and his eyes never left mine. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart thundering in my chest. I tried the engine one more time, and to my relief, it roared to life. I quickly shifted into drive and sped away, not daring to look back. The road twisted and turned, the fog thickening around me. My headlights barely cut through the haze, and the trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I had to get out of here. I had to get to the cabin. But the feeling of being watched never left. The road seemed endless, and every turn felt like it brought me deeper into the woods. It didn't make sense. I should have been out of the forest by now, and then I saw it again. The figure. Only this time, he was standing in front of the car, blocking the road completely. There was no way to avoid him, no way to get past. I slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a stop just inches from him. The figure slowly turned toward me, his face still featureless, still void of any expression. His eyes, those black pits, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with a suffocating cold. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The road was empty, silent. I didn't hesitate. I floored the gas pedal, not caring about anything else. I had to get out of there. I had to get somewhere, anywhere, where I could breathe again. The road stretched on, but this time I didn't care about the turns. I just needed to leave. It wasn't until I finally saw the lights of the cabin up ahead that I dared to breathe a sigh of relief. I hadn't realized until then how much I had been holding my breath. The door opened as I arrived. My friend Matt stepped out with a look of concern on his face. "You okay? You look pale as a ghost," he said. "I'm fine," I said, my voice trembling. "Just get me inside." He didn't ask any more questions, but as I glanced back at the road one last time, I saw something in the distance. A figure standing still, watching me from the edge of the trees. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was the kind of road trip that you hear about in old ghost stories. An endless stretch of asphalt through fields, forests, and desolate towns. The middle of nowhere. I'd been driving for hours, with no other cars in sight, no signs of life. Just me, my car, and the desolate landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. I had taken the trip on a whim. A weekend away, somewhere far from the noise of city life. The GPS led me down winding country roads, the type that were too narrow for two cars to pass comfortably. At first, the beauty of the open land with nothing but fields and trees for miles was peaceful. But as the sun began to set, a deep sense of isolation crept in. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite explain. The more I drove, the more I noticed how empty it was. The towns I passed were ghost towns, their buildings abandoned, windows boarded up. No cars, no people, not even a dog. It was eerie, like I had entered a place that no one dared visit anymore. I kept going. The cabin I was renting was a few more miles down the road, and I was eager to get there. But as the daylight faded, the isolation of the road began to press in on me. The trees on either side of the road were thick now, the dark canopy above casting the surroundings in shadows. The air felt colder than it should have been for that time of year, and a strange, unsettling silence filled the air, like the world was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. A house. A small, weathered house sitting off the side of the road. It looked abandoned, but there was something about it that made me stop. Maybe it was curiosity or just a strange impulse, but I pulled over. My tires kicked up gravel as I stopped on the shoulder, and I sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Boards nailed over the windows, the roof sagging, the yard overtaken by weeds. But then I saw something move in the yard. A figure. A person. A woman, standing near the broken fence. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could tell she was wearing a long, dark dress. She didn't move, not at first, just standing there, her back to me. I squinted, trying to make out any details. Maybe she was just another lost soul in this forgotten corner of the world. "Hey," I called out, unsure why I was talking to her. "Are you okay?" No response. I hesitated, but then I got out of the car and slowly walked toward the fence. There was something about her stillness that felt wrong, like she was waiting for something, or someone. "Excuse me," I said again, louder this time, my voice breaking the silence. "Are you all right?" Still no movement. I took another step forward to trot closer to the fence. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't place. A sense of unease grew in my stomach, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. She was just an old woman, probably lonely, living in this desolate place. But then I saw her face. It wasn't just old, it was wrong. Her skin was pale, almost white, and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were wide open but unseeing, a hollow, empty stare that seemed to go right through me. Her mouth hung slightly open, as though she was about to speak, but no sound came. There was something deeply unnatural about her, something that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I froze. Suddenly, the wind kicked up, and the woman's body jerked unnaturally, like a puppet with its strings pulled too tight. She turned her head slowly, too slowly, until her empty gaze met mine. The look in her eyes sent a shiver down my spine. She wasn't just looking at me. She was looking through me. "Help me," she whispered. The words were barely audible, but they cut through the air like a blade. I didn't understand. I couldn't comprehend what she meant, but instinctively I stepped back, my pulse quickening. My brain was screaming at me to leave, but my feet were frozen to the ground, and then, without warning, the wind stopped. The air grew still, and the silence returned, only now it felt worse, like the entire world was holding its breath. The woman tilted her head and her eyes narrowed. A strange, twisted grin spread across her face, a grin that wasn't human. It was the kind of smile you see in nightmares, a grin that stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and yellowed. My heart hammered in my chest, and I turned and ran back to the car without looking back. I fumbled for the keys in my pocket, my hands shaking. When I finally got the door open, I slammed it shut behind me, and I didn't even bother to start the car right away. I just sat there, panting, trying to calm myself. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, but nothing happened. The woman didn't appear outside my window. The house remained still, abandoned and lifeless. Still, the feeling of dread didn't leave me. It was like something was waiting for me, lurking just out of sight. I didn't care to find out what. I started the car and quickly drove off, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I didn't want to look back, but I had to. The woman wasn't there anymore, but something else was. The house, once standing alone, now had a figure standing in the doorway. I couldn't see who it was, but I knew it was watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the cabin. It was much later than I'd planned to arrive, and the sun had long disappeared behind the horizon. I could barely make out the shape of the cabin in the dark, but it was there, just as promised, secluded and surrounded by trees. I stayed inside for the rest of the night, too afraid to go outside again. The feeling that something was wrong didn't leave me, even though I was far from the house. It felt like the world itself had shifted, like I had crossed into something that didn't belong in the real world. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed up my things, but as I was about to drive away, I noticed something strange. The house from the night before, where the woman had been, was gone. The land it had stood on was empty, no trace of it remaining, just an empty patch of overgrown grass where the house should have been. I drove out of that place without looking back. And to this day, I don't know what I saw or what happened that night, but I know one thing for certain. The middle of nowhere is more than just an empty place. It's a place where things can disappear and where things that shouldn't exist can find you. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I've always been the type of person who enjoys solitude. That's why when my friends suggested a weekend getaway in the middle of nowhere, I didn't hesitate to book the cabin. It was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, a break from the noise of city life. Little did I know it would end up being something I'd never forget. The cabin was located deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town and even farther from any other houses. It was isolated, perched on a small hill that overlooked a quiet, murky lake. The GPS was spotty at best, and I had to rely on the handwritten directions the owner had emailed me. By the time I arrived, the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. As I pulled up to the cabin, the first thing that struck me was how still everything was. There were no sounds, no birds, no wind, not even the rustling of trees. The silence was deafening. The cabin itself was small, quaint, with a wooden exterior that had weathered the years, and a little porch that looked out over the lake. The kind of place you'd imagine people retreating to when they needed to escape the world. I grabbed my bag and made my way inside. The door creaked open, and I stepped into the dimly lit living room. It smelled like old wood and dust. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen off to the side, and a staircase leading to a loft bedroom. Everything seemed fine, a bit rustic, but charming. I settled in, made myself some tea, and tried to shake off the unease that lingered in the back of my mind. I told myself I was being silly. This was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, not a horror movie. But as the night grew darker, that unease refused to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I had just finished reading a book by the fire when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping like a knock on the door. But then it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, I could tell that much. And it wasn't animal noises either. The knocks came in a rhythmic pattern, like someone was waiting for me to answer. I stood up, feeling a chill run through me. My heart began to race as I moved cautiously toward the door. I opened it a crack, but there was no one there. The porch was empty. I stepped outside, peering into the dark yard, but nothing stirred, just the lake, the trees, and the oppressive silence. I chalked it up to my imagination, or perhaps a branch tapping against the wood. But then I heard it again. The knocks. This time they came from the window behind me. My blood ran cold. I slowly turned around, my breath catching in my throat. The window was covered by curtains, but I could see a faint shadow moving behind them. Something or someone was there. I backed away, my legs shaking. I didn't know what to do. Should I go investigate? Or should I lock the doors and hide? My mind raced, but before I could make up my mind, I heard a whisper. Help me. The voice was soft, almost inaudible, but it sent a wave of panic through me. I couldn't tell where it came from. It wasn't from the window. It was as if it was coming from inside the cabin itself. I grabbed my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The realization hit me hard. I was completely alone, completely isolated. No one would hear me if something happened. I felt my stomach tighten, and I ran upstairs to the loft, locking the door behind me. I curled up on the bed, pulling the covers over my head. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house, every groan of the floorboards made my heart race. Hours passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. At around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, gathered my bag, and tiptoed down the stairs. The air in the cabin was suffocating, thick with fear. I had to get out. I moved quickly but quietly, not wanting to make a sound, as if the noise of my footsteps would summon whatever was watching me. But as I opened the front door, I froze. Standing just outside, bathed in the faint light of the porch, was a figure, a woman. She stood motionless, staring directly at me with hollow, unblinking eyes. Her face was pale, her features sharp and gaunt, as though she hadn't eaten in days. She wore a long, tattered dress that swayed slightly in the breeze. I tried to speak, but no words came. My throat was tight, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear. The woman didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, watching me. Then, as if hearing my thoughts, she lifted her arm, pointing directly at me. Her finger trembled, as if trying to reach me through the air. The movement was slow, deliberate. And then the whisper came again. Help me. Her voice was clearer this time. It was desperate, pleading. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I ran to the back of the cabin, looking for a way out. There had to be another door, a window, anything, but the cabin was completely sealed. I went back to the front door, peering through the peephole. The woman was gone. But the sense of dread didn't leave. In fact, it intensified. I could hear something moving outside, something shuffling, dragging itself along the ground. The tapping on the door started again, this time more frantic, more desperate. I had to leave. I had to get out now. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the car, not looking back. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door and I jumped in, slamming it shut. I started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, driving as fast as I could down the narrow, winding road. The further I drove, the more I began to calm down, telling myself that it was just a bad dream. I had imagined it all. The knocking, the woman, the whispers, they were just tricks of my mind, fed by isolation. But then I glanced in the rearview mirror. I swear I saw her standing at the edge of the road, watching me drive away. Her pale face was just visible in the reflection, her eyes following me, and that same haunting whisper filled my ears. Help me. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. The middle of nowhere had a way of making you question reality. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The night I encountered something I couldn't explain began with a solo road trip, a decision I would soon regret. I had been driving for hours, heading towards a small remote town in the middle of nowhere. It was meant to be a quick getaway, just a change of scenery, a break from the chaos of city life. My GPS kept directing me through winding roads, taking me further and further from civilization. The sun had already set, and the road was dark, save for my headlights, cutting through the thickening fog. The eerie stillness of the night began to settle in, and I felt a growing unease. The road seemed endless. My phone had no service, and the constant hum of the engine seemed to add to the isolation. The only thing I could hear was the occasional chirping of insects and the rustling of trees. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't want to break down. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like an hour. The last sign I passed was for a small town, but it seemed like miles ago. Just as I started to feel the creeping anxiety of being so far out, I saw something on the side of the road. At first, it looked like a shadow, something that didn't quite belong in the landscape. But as I drove closer, I could make out a figure, a man, standing alone, dressed in a faded jacket. He was on the edge of the forest, his back to the road, staring at the trees. There was something off about him, though. He stood perfectly still, unmoving. I slowed my car as I passed him, unsure if I should stop. The thought of stopping in the middle of nowhere, especially in such a remote place, didn't sit right with me. But I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I rolled down my window a little and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" There was no response. I called out again, louder this time, "Are you all right?" Still nothing. He didn't even move a muscle. It was as if he didn't hear me at all. A strange chill washed over me, and my instincts screamed that I shouldn't stay. I started driving again, my foot pressing down on the gas pedal harder than before, eager to get past this strange figure. As I did, I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see him disappearing into the darkness. But instead, the figure was now walking down the road, following my car. My breath caught in my throat. I floored the gas pedal, my heart racing. There was no way he could have caught up to me so fast. I had just passed him. He was too far back. My mind raced with questions, but the one that kept repeating was, how is this happening? I checked the rearview mirror again, and this time he was closer, much closer. I couldn't see his face. He was just a shadow in the distance, but I could feel his presence. It was suffocating, like a weight pressing against my chest. His pace was unnervingly slow, but it didn't matter. He was gaining on me. I looked ahead, desperate to find a way out of this madness, but the road ahead was empty, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The fog was thickening, and the air inside the car grew colder. It felt like time had slowed down, and every second was drawn out in a way that made my heart pound harder. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure disappeared. I didn't see him in the mirror anymore. There was no trace of him on the road behind me. I couldn't bring myself to look around. I just kept my eyes straight ahead, trying to push my fear back. I knew I had to keep going. I couldn't stop. But the feeling of being watched never left. I drove for what seemed like an eternity, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see the figure again. But the road remained empty. The fog was getting thicker, almost suffocating now, and I was starting to question whether I had imagined the whole thing. The logical part of my brain told me it was just my nerves, the isolation, and the long drive playing tricks on me. After a while, the road curved sharply, and I suddenly saw lights ahead. It was a small gas station, its neon sign flickering dimly in the distance. I sighed in relief, eager to stop, stretch my legs, and shake off the lingering sense of dread that had followed me. I pulled into the gas station, and in the moment I stepped out of my car, the air felt different, heavy, colder than it should have been for that time of year. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an overwhelming sense that something wasn't right. I walked toward the door of the station and tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and I was greeted by a friendly face behind the counter. "Evening, miss," he said with a tired smile. "What can I do for you?" I gave him a nod and tried to act casual. "Just need to stretch my legs. Been driving for hours." "You're a long way from anywhere," he remarked, glancing outside at the dark road. "Where are you headed?" "Just passing through," I said, not wanting to go into detail about the strange man I had seen. Something told me he wouldn't understand. "How's the road up ahead?" He hesitated, his smile fading slightly. "It's fine, but this area has a reputation. People around here say they've seen things, not just on the road, but out in the woods. Ghost stories, mostly." I raised an eyebrow, trying to laugh it off. "Ghost stories? Come on, you don't believe that stuff, do you?" He shrugged. "I don't know. People swear they've seen figures out there, at night especially. Just be careful." I didn't want to admit that I had already seen something, but I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling in my gut. I left the station quickly, but as I walked back to my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man. The figure from the road. He was standing at the edge of the trees across the street from the gas station, just like before. His head was tilted slightly, and his hands hung limply at his sides. I froze. My car was still running, so I didn't waste a second. I rushed to the driver's seat, heart pounding in my chest. As I started the car, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him following me again. But he wasn't there. The road stretched ahead, empty. The fog still hung thick in the air, but the figure had vanished, just like before. I didn't stop until I reached my destination. Another town, a little more populated. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something I couldn't explain. I still drive at night, but I always make sure to stay in well-lit areas. And sometimes when I'm driving alone, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that same figure standing in the fog, watching me. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The last thing I expected when I decided to take a solo trip into the middle of nowhere was for it to become a nightmarish experience I'd never be able to forget. But that's exactly what happened. I was looking for solitude. The world had been loud and overwhelming, and I needed to get away. A cabin in a remote area of the mountains seemed like the perfect answer. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just peace and quiet. The nearest town was over an hour away, and the cabin itself was accessible only by a dirt road that had clearly seen better days. I was driving alone, just me and my thoughts, and as I passed through fields and forests, the isolation started to feel almost comforting. I arrived just before sunset. The cabin was exactly what I had imagined, small, with a wraparound porch and surrounded by trees. The air was crisp and clean, and the view over the valley below was breathtaking. It seemed like the perfect escape. The owner had given me simple instructions. Everything I needed was inside, and if I needed anything, I could call them. No neighbors, no traffic, just nature and quiet. I spent the evening unpacking and settling in, making a fire in the hearth and cooking myself a simple meal. As night fell, the silence around me became more pronounced. There were no sounds of passing cars, no distant voices, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the old cabin's wooden beams. It was both peaceful and unnerving. but I tried to shake off the unease, reminding myself that I had come here for this quiet. It was around 10 p.m. when things started to get weird. I was lying in bed, reading a book by the dim light of a lamp, when I heard a soft sound coming from outside. A tapping, like someone knocking on the door. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting the wood, but the sound was rhythmic and deliberate. I got up and went to the door, peeking through the peephole. No one. I stepped outside to look around, the chill of the night air hitting me immediately. The moon was barely visible through the thick trees, and everything around me seemed still. I took a deep breath and figured imagined it, the wind playing tricks on me. But as I was about to go back inside, I heard it again, the tapping, this time from the side of the house. I froze. My heart started to race. I had no neighbors, no other houses for miles. Who could possibly be out there? I slowly walked around the cabin, shining my flashlight into the woods, but the beam only illuminated trees and shadows, no sign of anyone. The tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. The woods were eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that made you feel like the whole world was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, just a branch or an animal. I turned and went back inside, double locking the door behind me. The night passed without incident. I didn't sleep well, though. My mind kept wandering back to the tapping sound. The next morning, I woke up to bright sunlight streaming through the cabin windows. The world outside seemed calm, peaceful even. I made myself a coffee and went outside to sit on the porch, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. It was then that I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Not animal tracks, but human-sized prints. Bare footprints leading from the side of the house where I had heard the tapping the night before. The prints stopped just short of the porch and disappeared into the woods. I felt a cold chill wash over me. Who had been out here? There was no way anyone could have gotten close to the cabin without me hearing them. The road was rough, and the area around the cabin was thick with trees. I hadn't seen a single car or person on my way in. I tried to push the thought out of my mind. Maybe I had missed them the night before. Maybe it had been some lost hiker or a neighbor checking in. I convinced myself to not overthink it. But that afternoon, things got stranger. I was inside the cabin, reading again, when I heard a sound coming from upstairs. It was faint at first, but as I listened, I realized it was the sound of something, or someone, walking. Slow, deliberate steps across the floor above me. I had checked the entire cabin when I arrived, and there was nothing upstairs except for a small loft. I had locked that room as I was planning to stay only on the lower level. The steps continued, moving back and forth as if someone was pacing. My stomach twisted into a knot. I slowly made my way to the stairs, my hand gripping the railing. I called out, hoping it was just an animal, but I got no answer. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated before pushing open the door to the loft. The room was empty. There were no signs of anyone having been there. The bed was made, the furniture undisturbed, but the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, and yet there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been walking around. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my things, packed up quickly, and went downstairs to lock the door. As I did, I heard a faint voice. It was soft, barely audible, but it came from somewhere inside the cabin. A whisper. "Help me." The words were unmistakable, and they sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced. Was I imagining it? Was I just spooked? But the voice was real. It was like it was right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I didn't waste any more time. I bolted for my car, almost tripping over myself in my haste. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As soon as I started the engine, I floored it, not even bothering to look back. I drove straight through the night, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a hotel and locked myself in for the rest of the night. Even now, months later, I can still hear the tapping sound sometimes when I'm alone, and I know deep down that whatever was out there in the middle of nowhere, whatever I encountered in that cabin, wasn't a figment of my imagination. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
It was supposed to be a simple drive. Ben had left the city late, aiming to beat the morning traffic to the small town where his sister lived. The route was straightforward on the map, a long stretch of highway followed by a detour through some quiet country roads. But somewhere along the way, his GPS stopped working, leaving him in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness. The road stretched endlessly, flanked by dense woods on both sides. His fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. Ben cursed under his breath and kept driving, hoping to stumble upon a gas station. Minutes turned into an hour, and the feeling of isolation grew heavier. Finally, he spotted something in the distance, a small wooden sign barely visible in his headlights. It read, Davenport, 2 miles. Relieved, Ben turned down the narrow dirt road indicated by the sign, the tires crunching over gravel. The town, if you could call it that, was eerily silent. A few old houses stood scattered around what might have once been a main street, their windows dark and lifeless. There were no cars, no streetlights, no sign of people. He drove slowly, his unease growing. At the end of the street, a dimly lit gas station came into view. Its lone pump looked ancient, and the building itself was more of a shack. Still, it was his only option. Ben parked and stepped out into the chilly night air. The smell of damp earth and rust lingered. He pushed open the creaking door of the station, the bell above it jingling faintly. Inside, the shelves were half empty, stocked with dusty cans and faded candy wrappers. Behind the counter sat an old man with a gaunt face, his eyes glassy and distant. Evening, Ben said, forcing a polite tone. I need to fill up. You take card? The old man didn't respond immediately. His gaze seemed to drift past Ben, as though he were looking at something or someone just over his shoulder. Ben turned to check, but the station was empty. Cash only, the old man finally rasped, his voice dry and brittle. Ben sighed, fishing a few bills out of his wallet. The man nodded slowly and handed him a rusted key attached to a wooden block. Pump's outside. Be quick, the man said. The words sent a shiver down Ben's spine, but he ignored it and stepped back outside. He unlocked the pump, the nozzle screeching as he pulled it free. The night had grown colder, and the woods surrounding the station seemed darker than before. As the gas flowed, a faint noise caught his attention, a soft, rhythmic tapping. He glanced around but saw nothing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from the woods. Ben stared into the shadows, his eyes straining to see past the tree line. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a figure darting between the trees, too quick and too pale to be an animal. Hello? He called out, his voice shaky. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Ben shook his head, laughing nervously. It's nothing, he muttered to himself, trying to convince himself he was just tired. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. He replaced the nozzle and hurried back toward his car. As he reached for the door handle, he froze. There were footprints, wet, muddy prints leading from the pump to the driver's side door. They hadn't been there before. His heart pounded as he scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. He yanked the door open, jumped in, and locked the doors. As he fumbled to start the car, the tapping began again, this time on the back window. Ben's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head. A face stared back at him, pale and gaunt, its eyes black pits that seemed to suck the light out of the air. The figure's mouth moved soundlessly, its bony fingers pressed against the glass. Ben screamed, slamming the car into reverse and flooring it. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the car sped backward. He swerved onto the dirt road, his tires kicking up gravel, and raced away from the gas station. The road twisted and turned, the trees closing in on either side. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure following him, but the road behind was empty. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. A new sound emerged, soft whispers, growing louder, filling the car. They came from nowhere and everywhere, overlapping voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The air grew colder, and the windshield began to fog up despite the heater being off. Ben wiped at it with his sleeve, only to see words forming on the glass, written by an unseen hand. You don't belong here. Panic surged through him as he pressed the accelerator harder, desperate to get back to the highway. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly, no landmarks, no sign of escape. The whispers turned to laughter, high-pitched, mocking, and impossibly close. His headlights flickered, and for a moment everything went dark. When the lights came back on, the road had changed. It wasn't the dirt path he'd been driving on. It was cracked asphalt, lined with old, rusted streetlights. The houses on either side were burned-out husks, their windows shattered. He slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a stop. This wasn't where he'd been. This wasn't Davenport. The laughter stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. Ben stepped out of the car, his legs shaky. The air smelled of smoke and decay. In the distance, he saw a figure standing under a streetlight. It was the same gaunt face from before, watching him, waiting. "Stay away!" He shouted, his voice breaking. The figure didn't move, but behind him, others began to emerge from the shadows. Pale, hollow-eyed figures stepping out of the ruins, their movements slow and deliberate. They surrounded him, their expressions blank, but their intent clear. Ben backed away, but there was nowhere to go. His car was gone. The road was gone. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the pale face of the figure under the streetlight, smiling. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The road stretched endlessly into the night, bordered by dense fields of tall grass that whispered in the wind. The only sound was the hum of the old Ford truck's engine as Emma gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. She wasn't supposed to be out this late. Her grandfather's old farm was hours behind her, and the highway she thought she'd find by now was nowhere in sight. Instead, she was on a narrow, winding dirt road in the middle of nowhere. Her phone was dead. The radio had long stopped picking up stations, and the gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. Emma squinted at the darkness ahead, trying to convince herself she wasn't lost. The road curved sharply, and as her headlights swept across the landscape, she caught sight of a weathered wooden sign, barely readable. Winton Hollow, 2 miles. Her stomach tightened. She didn't remember any Winton Hollow on the map, but with no other choice, she decided to follow the road. She just needed gas or someone to point her back to the highway. The truck rattled as the dirt road gave way to cracked pavement. The trees overhead thickened, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. Emma's headlights reflected off something ahead, an old gas station. Its single pump was rusted, and the sign on the small building was missing several letters. Emma pulled in hesitantly, stepping out of the truck. The night was colder than she expected, and the air smelled damp and earthy, like something long forgotten. The building's windows were dark, but a faint flicker of light came from inside. She knocked on the door. "Hello? Anyone here?" The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was older, his face lined and pale, his clothes hanging loosely on his thin frame. His eyes, however, were sharp, studying her intently. "Evening," he said, his voice low. "Need help?" Emma nodded. "Yeah, I'm low on gas. Can I fill up here?" The man hesitated, glancing at her truck, then back at her. "Pump's old, but it'll work. Cash only." Emma dug into her wallet, relieved she had a few bills. "Thank you." The man turned to activate the pump, but before he did, he said, "You're not from around here, are you?" "No, I was just passing through," Emma said, trying to sound casual. "I think I took a wrong turn." He nodded slowly, but there was something uneasy in his expression. "Best you get back on the road soon. Don't stay in Winton Hollow after dark." The comment made her pause. "Why?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he began pumping the gas, his movements stiff and deliberate. Emma's skin prickled as she glanced around. The gas station looked like it hadn't seen regular customers in years. The only light came from a single dim bulb hanging above the door. Beyond that, the road disappeared into shadow. The tank clicked full, and the man handed her the receipt. "Straight road out of here," he said quietly. "Don't stop. Don't look back." Emma forced a smile. "Thanks." She climbed into the truck, his words echoing in her mind. Shaking her head, she started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The gas station quickly vanished in her rearview mirror. The road grew narrower, and the trees pressed closer. The darkness felt heavier, almost tangible, like it was swallowing her headlights. She tried to focus on the road, but unease crept into her chest. Then she saw it, something in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, her truck skidding to a halt. It was a woman standing barefoot on the cracked pavement, her white dress billowing in the windless night. Her face was turned away, her long dark hair obscuring her features. Emma's heart pounded. She rolled down the window, her voice shaking. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't move. Emma debated getting out, but something about the woman's stillness made her hesitate. The unease she'd felt earlier grew into full-blown fear. "Ma'am?" she called again, louder this time. The woman turned slowly, unnaturally, as though her neck were a rusted hinge. Emma froze. The woman's face was wrong, her features blurred, like a smudged painting, and her eyes were empty. Just black voids that seemed to pull at Emma's very soul. The woman took a step forward. Panic surged through Emma, and she floored the gas pedal. The truck roared past the figure, who didn't move but seemed to watch her as she sped away. Emma's hands trembled on the wheel, her breathing ragged. "Just keep going," she whispered to herself. "Just keep going." The road stretched on, endlessly winding through the oppressive darkness. She glanced in the rearview mirror, and her stomach dropped. The woman was there, standing in the middle of the road, growing smaller, but never disappearing, no matter how far Emma drove. She tried to shake it off, convincing herself it was her imagination. But then she saw something ahead. More figures. They lined the road on either side, standing motionless in the tall grass. Men, women, even children, all of them with the same blurred faces and hollow, empty eyes. They didn't move, didn't react to the truck's headlights as Emma barreled past them. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she gripped the wheel tighter. She couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The truck's radio crackled to life, static hissing loudly before a voice broke through. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. "Emma," it whispered. She slammed the radio off, her chest heaving. How did it know her name? The truck sputtered, and Emma's heart sank. "No, no, no," she muttered, willing the vehicle to keep going. But the engine died, and the truck rolled to a stop. Silence. Emma sat frozen, gripping the wheel, her eyes darting to the windows. The figures were closer now, stepping out of the grass and onto the road. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like predators stalking prey. "Stay away," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. The figures surrounded the truck, their faces pressing against the windows. The glass fogged from their breath, and their hands, thin, claw-like, dragged across the surface, making a faint screeching sound. Emma fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Please, please, please." The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the cab of the truck. Words she couldn't understand, voices overlapping, growing more frantic. One of the figures slammed a hand against the driver's side window, and the glass spider-webbed with cracks. Emma screamed, throwing open the passenger door and stumbling into the road. She ran. The whispers chased her, the figures gliding after her with an impossible speed. The road twisted and turned, but no matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape them. Finally, she tripped, falling hard onto the pavement. The whispers stopped. Emma looked up, panting, and realized she was back at the gas station. The old man was standing outside, his expression grim. "I told you not to stop," he said softly. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but a hand clamped down on her shoulder. She turned, and the last thing she saw was the woman from the road, her black eyes consuming everything. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The gas station attendant had warned her not to take the back roads. "They're easy to get lost on," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of a warning that sounded more serious than the words themselves. But Nina, stubborn and running late, decided to ignore the advice. The highway was clogged with cars heading home from a football game, and she figured a shortcut through the countryside would save her at least an hour. The road had started off paved, but quickly deteriorated into gravel, then dirt. Her little sedan bounced over potholes, and every turn seemed to take her deeper into the wilderness. The trees pressed closer, their skeletal branches scraping against the roof like the talons of some unseen creature. She hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and her cell phone had no service. Her unease grew as the last traces of sunlight faded, leaving her alone in the suffocating darkness of the middle of nowhere. That's when she saw it, a figure standing in the road ahead. Nina slammed on the brakes, her tires skidding on the loose gravel. The car came to a stop just a few feet from the person, who stood motionless in the beam of her headlights. It was a woman, barefoot and dressed in a tattered white nightgown that clung to her thin frame. Her long hair hung over her face, obscuring her features. "Are you okay?" Nina called out, rolling her window down slightly. The woman didn't respond, didn't move. She just stood there, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Nina felt her stomach twist. Something was wrong. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but her conscience wouldn't let her. She opened the door, stepping out cautiously. "Do you need help?" she asked, her voice shaking. The woman raised her head slowly. Her face came into view and Nina's breath caught in her throat. The woman's eyes were black, completely black, with no whites, no irises, just endless voids that seemed to suck the air out of the night. Nina stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The woman began to move toward her, not walking but gliding, her feet never touching the ground. Panic overtook her. She scrambled back into the car, slamming the door and locking it. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, turning the ignition. The engine sputtered, but wouldn't start. Come on," she whispered desperately, glancing up. The woman was gone. Nina's blood ran cold. She looked around frantically, her headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. Then came the sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the back window. Her breath hitched as she turned slowly, her body frozen with fear. The woman's face was pressed against the glass, her black eyes staring directly into Nina's. Nina screamed, slamming her fist on the horn. The blaring sound filled the car, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, her lips parted into a grin, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. The engine roared to life suddenly, and Nina didn't hesitate. She threw the car into drive and sped forward, her tires kicking up gravel. The tapping stopped, but she didn't dare look back. The road twisted and turned, the trees blurring past in her peripheral vision. She kept glancing at her rearview mirror, expecting to see the woman chasing her, but the road behind remained empty. Her relief was short-lived. As she rounded a bend, her headlights caught something ahead, another figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't the woman this time. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans. He stood with his back to her, unmoving. Nina's heart raced as she slowed the car. She considered swerving around him, but the road was narrow and flanked by steep ditches on either side. She honked the horn, hoping he'd move. He didn't. "Get out of the way," she yelled, her voice trembling. The man began to turn slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. When his face came into view, Nina felt a wave of nausea. His eyes were black, just like the woman's. Before she could react, the car lurched to a stop. The engine died and the lights flickered out, plunging her into darkness. Nina's chest tightened as she tried the key again and again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. She reached for her phone, but it was still useless. No signal, no hope. A knock on the driver's side window made her jump. She turned to see the man standing there, his face inches from the glass, his black eyes staring at her with a chilling intensity. "Let me in," he said, his voice low and guttural. Nina shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No! Go away!" The man's expression didn't change. He placed his hand on the window and frost began to spread across the glass, spiderwebbing outward. The temperature inside the car plummeted, her breath fogging up the windshield. She screamed as the locks on the doors clicked open on their own. The man grinned, his hand gripping the handle. In a surge of adrenaline, Nina grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and swung it at his face. It passed through him as if he weren't there. His grin widened as he climbed into the car, his body folding and twisting unnaturally to fit through the door. The last thing Nina saw before everything went black was his face, inches from hers, whispering something she couldn't understand. When Nina woke up, she was sitting in her car on the side of a quiet highway. The sun was rising, casting golden light across the landscape. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles were white. She looked around, disoriented. The dirt road, the gas station, the black-eyed figures, they were all gone. For a moment, she thought it might have been a nightmare, but as she adjusted the rearview mirror, her stomach dropped. In the back seat, faint but unmistakable, was the imprint of a hand, smeared across the fogged-up glass. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The gravel crunched under Emily's tires as she drove down the winding back road. Her GPS had died over an hour ago, and the nearest sign of civilization was miles behind her. She cursed under her breath, her hands gripping the steering wheel, as the thick fog rolled in, shrouding the road ahead in an eerie gray. She had no business being out here alone. What was supposed to be a shortcut to shave an hour off her trip home had turned into a nightmare. Every road seemed to look the same, endless stretches of cracked asphalt lined by towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. Her phone buzzed uselessly in the passenger seat, the dreaded no service icon glowing mockingly. Emily sighed. Great, she muttered. Just great. As the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness settled in quickly, enveloping the landscape in shadow. Her headlights pierced the fog, illuminating only a few feet ahead. She was in the middle of nowhere, and the weight of that realization sat heavy in her chest. Up ahead, a sign emerged from the mist, weathered and barely legible. Hollow Creek, 1 mile. The name sent an unexplainable chill down her spine, but the prospect of reaching any sort of town was better than aimlessly wandering these desolate roads. She pressed on, the road narrowing and the forest growing denser. The first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of life. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. The second thing she noticed was the figure. It appeared suddenly, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by her high beams. Emily slammed on the brakes, her car skidding slightly before coming to a stop. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the figure. A man, dressed in old, tattered clothes, his head bowed so low she couldn't see his face. She rolled down her window just enough to call out, "Are you okay?" The man didn't move. The unease creeping up her spine turned to outright fear. Something about the way he stood, so still, so lifeless, felt wrong. She rolled the window back up and locked her doors, her fingers trembling as she shifted the car into reverse. Before she could move, the man lifted his head. Emily screamed. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, empty, black voids, bored into her. He tilted his head to one side, a jerky, unnatural motion, and began walking toward her car. She slammed on the gas, swerving around him as her tires kicked up gravel. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what she might see. The road twisted and turned, her headlights barely illuminating the path ahead. The fog thickened, clinging to her car like a living thing. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached. "Just get to the town," she whispered to herself. "Just get to Hollow Creek." But the road seemed endless. The further she drove, the darker it became, as if the night itself was swallowing her whole. The trees pressed in closer, their gnarled branches scraping against her windows like skeletal fingers. Then she saw it again, the figure, standing in the middle of the road exactly as before. Her breath hitched. It couldn't be possible. She had left him miles behind. But there he was, unmoving, his hollow eyes locked onto her. This time she didn't stop. She swerved around him, her car narrowly missing the ditch. Her chest felt tight, her heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. She drove faster, desperate to escape. The road twisted again, and she came to an abrupt stop. Her headlights illuminated an old bridge, its wooden planks weathered and rotting. Beyond it was a small cluster of buildings, a gas station, a diner, and a few houses. Hollow Creek. Relief washed over her as she crossed the bridge, the boards creaking ominously under her tires. The town was eerily still, but at least it was something. She pulled into the gas station, her car idling as she surveyed her surroundings. The gas station looked abandoned. The windows were dark, the paint peeling from the walls. A single bulb above the entrance flickered weakly. She stepped out of the car, her footsteps echoing on the pavement. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" No response. She tried the door, but it was locked. A chill ran down her spine as she glanced around the empty town. Every building looked deserted, as though no one had been here for years. Yet her eyes kept darting to the shadows, where she swore she saw movement. A faint sound caught her attention, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind her. She spun around, her heart in her throat. The man was there. Standing at the edge of the gas station lot, his head tilted in that unnatural way. He didn't move toward her, but his presence was suffocating. Emily bolted for her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She threw open the door and jumped inside, locking it with shaking hands. Her fingers fumbled as she started the engine, the headlights flickering on. He was gone. She didn't waste another second. The tires squealed as she tore out of the lot, the small town vanishing in her rearview mirror. The road stretched on, winding through the endless forest. She kept her eyes on the road, too afraid to look back. but the whispering started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the engine, a low, raspy voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emily. Her name. It whispered her name. She clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. Stop it! Leave me alone! The whispers grew louder, overlapping, drowning out her own thoughts. The road ahead blurred, the trees bending and twisting as if alive. And then, the truck died. The engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and the car rolled to a stop. She sat there in the suffocating silence, too terrified to move. The whispering stopped, but the man was there, standing in the middle of the road, closer than ever. His hollow eyes locked onto hers, and a twisted grin spread across his face. Emily screamed as the windows fogged over, handprints appearing on the glass, pressing in from all sides. She scrambled to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The man raised his hand and pointed at her. The world went black. When Emily's truck was found 2 days later, it was parked on the side of an abandoned dirt road. The engine was cold, and the keys were still in the ignition. But Emily was gone, leaving behind no footprints, no signs of struggle, just the lingering scent of damp earth and the eerie silence of the middle of nowhere. Story the end.
Story number 13.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and the open road. I'd been feeling burnt out from work, so I rented a cabin a few hours outside the city to disconnect. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. It wasn't that I didn't want them to know, it just seemed unnecessary. I wanted solitude, and this cabin in the middle of nowhere promised exactly that. The drive started off uneventful, the radio humming softly as I passed through sleepy towns and long stretches of farmland. But somewhere along the way, my GPS lost signal. I wasn't worried. The cabin's address was written down, and I'd already memorized most of the route. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the landscape grew darker and lonelier. The paved road turned to gravel, then dirt. Trees closed in on either side, their twisted branches forming skeletal arches overhead. My headlights sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but more road ahead. It felt like I'd been driving forever when I saw it. A car pulled off to the side of the road, its hood propped open. A man stood next to it, waving one arm while holding a flashlight in the other. I slowed down, my instincts battling with caution. This wasn't exactly the kind of place where roadside assistance was easy to come by. Still, something felt off. The man wasn't waving frantically like someone in distress. It was slow, almost deliberate. I rolled down my window just a crack. "You need help?" I called out. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, the beam of his flashlight pointed at the ground. When he finally looked up, his face was cast in shadow, but I could see his mouth moving. "What?" I asked, leaning closer. "I said you shouldn't be here." His voice was low, almost drowned out by the hum of my engine. A chill ran down my spine. "All right," I said quickly, rolling up the window and pulling away. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road. His flashlight pointed directly at my car. My pulse quickened. I tried to shake off the encounter, chalking it up to a strange local, or maybe someone playing a prank. But as I continued down the road, unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. About 15 minutes later, I saw something up ahead. My headlights illuminated another car, an older model sedan parked off the shoulder. The hood was up. My heart sank. It was the same car. This time, the man wasn't standing beside it. He was sitting in the driver's seat, his face turned away from me. I slowed down instinctively, my grip tightening on the wheel. As I passed, his head snapped toward me, and I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were impossibly wide, and his mouth was twisted into a grin that didn't look human. I slammed the accelerator, my car fishtailing slightly on the dirt road. My hands were shaking, my breaths coming in short gasps. I didn't know how far I drove. Miles. Maybe more. The trees grew denser, the road rougher. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the shadows between the trees seemed to move. Then my car started to sputter. No, 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 I muttered, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. The fuel gauge showed half a tank, but the engine coughed and lurched like it was running on fumes. Finally, the car rolled to a stop, the engine dead. I sat there in stunned silence, the only sound my own panicked breathing. I tried the ignition. Nothing. The silence outside was deafening, pressing against the windows like a physical weight. I grabbed my phone, praying for even a sliver of service, but the screen displayed no signal. I had no choice but to get out. My flashlight was in the trunk, and I didn't want to be stranded without it. As soon as I stepped onto the road, the cold hit me. It wasn't the kind of chill you feel from the air. It was deeper, sinking into my bones. The forest felt alive, like it was watching me. I popped the trunk and grabbed the flashlight, fumbling with the switch. It flickered to life, casting a narrow beam of light into the trees. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, shuffling through the underbrush, but unmistakable. My chest tightened as I swung the flashlight toward the sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. No response. Footsteps grew louder, closer. I backed up until I hit the side of the car, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Something moved at the edge of the beam, just a shadow, quick and fleeting. My heart pounded as I scanned the trees, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it again. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was behind me. I spun around, the flashlight cutting through the darkness, but no one was there. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper. My ears strained to catch any sound, but the forest seemed to hold its breath. And then I saw them. Figures emerged from the trees, pale and thin, their faces featureless except for black, empty eyes. They moved slowly, their bodies swaying like they were caught in an invisible current. I dropped the flashlight, my instincts taking over as I scrambled back into the car. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my fingers fumbling for the keys even though I knew the engine was dead. The figures surrounded the car, their eyeless faces pressed against the windows. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. Their mouths opened in unison, black voids that seemed to pull the light from the world. And then everything went dark. When I woke up, it was morning. I was still in my car, parked on the side of a quiet country road. The engine started without hesitation, and my phone had full bars. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly left. In the rearview mirror, for just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me. Story the end.
Story number 14.
It was supposed to be a quick trip to visit her sister, but Jenna had underestimated just how remote the countryside could be. The endless expanse of flat fields and distant tree lines was beautiful in the daylight, but now, in the suffocating darkness of night, it was unnerving. The GPS on her phone had lost signal hours ago, and her car's gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. She sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. It was only supposed to be a 2-hour drive. Somehow she'd taken a wrong turn, and now she was stuck on a desolate stretch of road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick fog rolling across the road, and the headlights of her old sedan only illuminated the immediate path ahead. As the hours dragged on, the loneliness pressed on her chest. There were no streetlights, no houses, no other cars. Just the occasional rustle of the wind through the dry grass and the sound of her own tires crunching gravel. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the world had been put on pause. Then she saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road, just at the edge of her headlights. Jenna's heart lurched, her breath catching in her throat. At first she thought it was a deer, but as she drew closer she realized it was a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and he wasn't moving. She slowed the car, rolling to a near stop as she approached. "Are you okay?" she called through the cracked window, her voice shaky. The man didn't respond. His head was tilted slightly, as though he were listening, but he didn't look at her. Jenna's instincts screamed at her to keep driving, but something about the man's stillness held her in place. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hood, but she could tell something wasn't right. "Do you need help?" she asked again, louder this time. Slowly, the man turned his head to face her. Jenna's stomach dropped. His face was pale, unnaturally pale, and his eyes were sunken, hollow pits of darkness. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared at her. Jenna's body moved before her brain caught up. She hit the gas, the tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel before the car shot forward. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still standing there, motionless, watching her go. She told herself it was just some weird local or a prank, something she could laugh about later. But no matter how far she drove, the unease lingered. The road stretched on endlessly, each mile blending into the next. The fog grew thicker, wrapping around the car like a shroud. And then she saw him again. The same man, standing in the middle of the road. Jenna slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop mere feet from him. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she gripped the steering wheel. It couldn't be the same man. It wasn't possible. She had driven for miles. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of her. The man stood motionless, his empty eyes locked onto hers. She didn't wait this time. She swerved around him, narrowly avoiding the ditch, and sped off into the night. Her hands trembled as she drove. The radio crackled with static, the faint hint of a voice breaking through before cutting out entirely. She turned it off, the silence almost worse. She tried to convince herself it was a coincidence, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But the feeling in her gut told her otherwise. Minutes later, the car began to sputter. "No, no, no," Jenna whispered, glancing at the gas gauge. The needle was below empty. She'd been hoping to find a gas station or some sign of life, but there was nothing. The car gave one last shudder before the engine died, and Jenna coasted to a stop on the side of the road. She sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't want to get out of the car. She didn't want to face whatever was out there in the darkness. But staying put wasn't an option either. Grabbing her phone, she flicked on the flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. The silence was deafening. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked asphalt as she looked around, hoping to spot a light or a landmark in the distance. But the fog swallowed everything. Then she heard it. A faint shuffle, like footsteps on gravel. Jenna froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She turned slowly, the beam of light cutting through the mist. Her heart stopped when she saw him, the man, standing just a few feet away. This time, he was closer than ever. She could see his face clearly now, and it was worse than she had imagined. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, his mouth slightly open as if gasping for air. His black eyes glistened in the light, and Jenna swore she saw something move in them, like shadows shifting beneath the surface. "Stay back," she screamed, her voice cracking. The man didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at her, unflinching. Jenna backed away, her chest heaving with panic. She turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. The fog seemed to thicken, dragging at her legs like quicksand. She didn't dare look back, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind her. She tripped, falling hard onto the road. The flashlight skittered out of her hand, its beam flickering before settling on something ahead. A sign. Hollow Creek Cemetery. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the rusted sign. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the dark expanse of gravestones that loomed just beyond the trees. The footsteps stopped. Slowly, she turned. The man was gone. The road behind her was empty, swallowed by the fog. But she wasn't alone. The whispers began softly, barely audible, like 100 voices speaking all at once. They grew louder, filling her ears, drowning out her thoughts. Shapes emerged from the mist, figures with blurred faces, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded her, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. Jenna's scream was swallowed by the night. When search crews found her car days later, the tank was empty, and the driver's door was open. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, just a dead phone on the passenger seat and a lingering chill in the air. Story the end.
Story number 15.
The clock on the dashboard blinked 11:47 p.m., its pale green glow the only source of comfort in the desolate night. Ellie squinted through the windshield as her car crawled along the narrow road. Her GPS had lost signal over an hour ago, and there hadn't been a streetlight or another vehicle for miles. Just trees, endless rows of skeletal branches clawing at the sky. She cursed under her breath. The shortcut her coworker recommended had turned into a labyrinth of back roads, each one narrower and darker than the last. With no cell service and her fuel gauge precariously close to empty, Ellie was starting to regret not sticking to the highway. She rolled down the window slightly, hoping for a burst of fresh air to shake off the growing sense of unease. But the air was thick and stagnant, carrying an unsettling stillness that made her skin crawl. Not even the sound of crickets broke the silence. Then, out of nowhere, her headlights caught something. A figure standing by the side of the road. Ellie's foot hovered over the brake. It was a man, dressed in a dark coat, his back turned to her. He stood perfectly still, as though carved out of stone, his hands hanging limply at his sides. Ellie's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She slowed the car, the beams of her headlights stretching to illuminate him more clearly. He didn't move, didn't even turn to acknowledge her. Something about his posture, a stiffness that seemed almost unnatural, made her stomach knot. She rolled down her window a fraction and called out, "Hey, do you need help?" The man didn't respond. He remained motionless, his head tilted slightly downward. Ellie waited, her pulse hammering in her ears. A chill crept down her spine. "Okay," she murmured, rolling the window back up. She eased her foot off the brake, steering her car around him. As she passed, she couldn't help but glance at him again. His face, if you could call it that, was a pale, featureless blur. No eyes, no nose, just a smooth expanse of skin. Ellie's breath hitched, and her foot slammed down on the accelerator. The car roared forward, tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel. She didn't look back. The road stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and turning through the dense forest. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches arching over the road like the ribs of some great beast. Ellie's hands shook as she gripped the wheel, her eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. Empty. Just the same dark, empty road. She tried to rationalize what she'd seen. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe the man was wearing a mask. But deep down, she knew better. There had been something wrong about him, something that defied explanation. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Ellie's gas gauge dipped lower, the needle hovering just above E. Panic bubbled in her chest. If her car stalled out here, she didn't know what she would do. There was no sign of a gas station, no sign of civilization at all. And then she saw it again. The figure. Standing in the middle of the road this time, directly in her path. Ellie screamed, jerking the wheel to the left. The car swerved, narrowly missing him, and skidded to a stop on the shoulder. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she fumbled to steady her trembling hands. She turned to look back, expecting to see the figure standing where she'd left him. But the road behind her was empty. No sign of anyone or anything. Her heart raced as she debated what to do. She couldn't stay here, but the thought of driving further down this cursed road made her stomach churn. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. If she could just make it to a town, to a gas station, to anywhere, she'd be fine. She started the car again, the engine sputtering to life. Slowly, she pulled back onto the road, her eyes darting from side to side, scanning the darkness for any movement. The fog was thicker now, swirling around the car like living smoke. Her headlights barely pierced through it. A flicker of movement to her left caught her attention. Ellie's head snapped toward it, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. The radio crackled suddenly, a burst of static that made her jump. She reached to turn it off, but before her fingers touched the knob, a voice broke through. "Ellie!" Her name, spoken in a low, rasping whisper. She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was faint, distorted by the static, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, had said her name. The radio went silent. Ellie's foot pressed harder on the gas, the car picking up speed. Her breathing was shallow, her hands clammy against the wheel. She didn't care about conserving fuel anymore. She just wanted to get out of this place. The road curved sharply, and as she rounded the bend, her stomach dropped. In the distance, illuminated by her headlights, was a small, weathered sign. "Welcome to Hollow Pines Cemetery." Her chest tightened. She didn't remember passing a cemetery earlier. How could she have ended up here? The sign looked old, its paint peeling and letters faded, but it stood tall and ominous against the fog. She slowed the car, her mind racing. There had to be a turnoff she'd missed, a way back to the main road. She couldn't keep driving in circles. As she inched forward, the car's engine sputtered again. This time, it didn't recover. The vehicle jerked to a halt, and the dashboard lights flickered before going dark. "No, no, no," Ellie whispered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The engine groaned but refused to start, and then she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the gravel. Ellie's head whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. The fog outside the car had thickened, swirling in strange, unnatural patterns. The footsteps grew louder, closer. A shadow emerged from the mist. It was him, the man with the featureless face. Ellie screamed, slamming her hands against the steering wheel. The man didn't flinch. He moved closer, his steps unhurried, his empty face tilting as if studying her. Desperation overtook her. She grabbed her phone, but there was still no signal. The flashlight app barely cut through the fog as she pointed it toward the window. The man was gone, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. They were louder now, circling the car. Ellie twisted in her seat, trying to track the sound, but the fog obscured everything. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she locked all the doors, her shaking fingers barely managing to press the button. And then the whispers began. Soft at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but they grew louder, overlapping, incomprehensible. Ellie clamped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head. The windows fogged up, and handprints began to appear, one after another, pressing against the glass from the outside. Each one was smeared, distorted, as though the hands were too large, too twisted to be human. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and Ellie screamed, her voice drowned out by the cacophony. The world around her blurred, the fog seeping into the car, cold and suffocating. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was her own reflection in the rearview mirror, and the man's featureless face staring back at her from the back seat. When Ellie's car was found the next morning, it was parked on the side of an empty road. The doors were locked and the keys were still in the ignition, but Ellie was gone. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just a single handprint smeared across the inside of the windshield. Story the end.
Story number 16.
I had always heard that the middle of nowhere could be a place of peace, but I soon learned it could also be a place where time seemed to bend and shadows lingered longer than they should. It started with a solo road trip. I'd been planning the trip for months, looking for some time away from the noise of city life. The idea was simple. Drive out to a cabin I'd rented online, tucked away in the woods somewhere far off from civilization. It was supposed to be quiet, just me and the trees, the sky, and the sound of my own thoughts. The drive itself was peaceful at first. The sun had been setting, casting an orange hue across the open highway. There was nothing around me but miles of empty land. I passed a few small towns, but they were so far apart, it felt like I was alone in the world. My car hummed along, the only sound breaking the stillness. I wasn't in a rush. The GPS kept me on course, winding me through small country roads that slowly turned into gravel paths. I didn't mind. The idea of being disconnected for a few days appealed to me. No work emails, no deadlines, just freedom. But as I ventured deeper into the countryside, things started to feel different. The quiet grew heavier, almost suffocating as the trees closed in on both sides of the road. The air felt thick, even though it wasn't hot. I turned the radio off and just let the car coast. That's when I saw it, a figure standing off the road, partially hidden by a large tree. At first I thought it was a person, but then I realized it was too still, too motionless. I slowed down, trying to make sense of it. The figure had a weathered appearance, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing. A long, dark coat, wide-brimmed hat. But the most unsettling thing was how it stood there, unmoving. It felt out of place, as if it didn't belong on this road at all. I continued driving, a little faster now, trying not to dwell on it. But the figure remained in my rearview mirror, never moving, just there. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. A few more miles down the road, I came across a small abandoned house by the side of the road. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. Windows boarded up, the roof sagging. My curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled over to take a look. The wind picked up slightly as I stepped out of the car, the scent of damp wood and earth surrounding me. There was a strange heaviness in the air, like the house was holding something in, something unseen. I walked around the house cautiously. There was nothing remarkable about it, just peeling paint and the overgrown weeds taking over the front yard. But then I saw it, a small figure standing in the yard just outside the house. It was a child. At first, I couldn't make out any details. The figure was facing away from me, standing motionless by the broken fence. A part of me felt a sense of relief. A child, maybe lost, in need of help. But when I took a few steps closer, my breath caught in my throat. The child was still. It didn't turn to acknowledge me, didn't make a sound. The sun had set by this point, and the darkness wrapped around the house like a blanket. As I approached, I could see the child more clearly now. A girl, no older than 7 or 8, wearing a tattered white dress. Her hair was long and wild, hanging around her face. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I forced my legs to take another step forward. "Hey," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond. She just stood there, her back turned to me, motionless. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something wasn't right. But before I could take another step, I heard a soft voice behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, my heart pounding. No one was there. I looked back at the girl. Still no movement. The same eerie stillness. The voice, I realized, was not a human one. It was far too low, too distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly backed away, trying to keep my composure. The girl didn't follow me, but I could feel her eyes on me, despite her not moving. I reached my car in a near panic, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the door handle. Finally, I got inside and slammed the door shut, locking it. The drive felt longer on the way out. The wind howled around the car, the trees swaying unnaturally in the darkness. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly. My phone was dead, no service anywhere. It was just me, the car, and the oppressive darkness. And then a sound. A tapping. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was rhythmic, persistent. I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. The girl. She was sitting in the back seat, her small figure illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Her eyes were wide open, her face pale, her mouth stretched into an unsettling, unnatural grin, her head tilted to one side. I could barely breathe. My fingers trembled as I tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The tapping continued, louder now, as if she was getting closer. I yanked the door open and bolted out of the car, running blindly into the woods. My heart raced, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Branches whipped at my face, my clothes, but I didn't stop. The sound of the tapping grew fainter as I ran, but the dread never left me. I don't know how long I ran. When I finally stopped, breathless and exhausted, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trees seemed to have closed in around me, the road nowhere in sight. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. No girl, no tapping, just silence. I couldn't stay there. I turned back, retracing my steps, but the woods were unfamiliar. It felt like they were shifting, The oppressive quiet was maddening. It was hours before I finally stumbled back to the road. I didn't stop to check my car. I didn't care. I just kept walking, my legs weak, my body trembling. Finally, a passing car saw me and stopped, the driver offering me a ride. The next morning, I called the cabin rental to cancel. When I explained where I'd been, the woman on the phone paused. "That house, you saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice suddenly strained. I didn't answer. She continued, her voice low. "Don't go back there. No one ever comes back from that place. And if you see the girl, you're already too late." I hung up. I didn't need to hear any more. I wasn't going back. Ever. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 17.
I was in the middle of nowhere, both figuratively and literally, when it happened. I'd driven out to a remote cabin in the mountains, hoping for some peace and solitude. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. It was supposed to be a break from the noise of the city, a chance to reset my mind and escape the stress of my job. The cabin was small, nestled between towering pines, surrounded by a thick forest that stretched as far as I could see. It was exactly what I had been looking for, or so I thought. The first few days were everything I had hoped for, tranquil, beautiful, and blissfully quiet. I spent my days hiking, reading, and cooking simple meals over the fire. The evenings were filled with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was a perfect escape from everything. But on the fourth night, something changed. It was a clear, cold evening, and I had just finished dinner when I noticed something strange. A soft knock at the door. I paused, unsure if I had heard it correctly. No one lived nearby. The nearest town was over an hour away, and there were no neighbors within miles. I stood up and walked over to the door, my heart pounding a little faster than usual. I opened it. The night air hit me with a chill, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the forest beyond was still. I stepped outside, looking around, but I saw nothing unusual. Only the trees bathed in moonlight, their shadows stretching long across the ground. I was probably imagining things, I thought. Maybe a branch had shifted in the wind and caused a sound that resembled knocking. I shrugged it off and went back inside. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. Another knock, this time louder, more insistent. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my mind racing. There was no way anyone could be out here at this hour. I moved slowly toward the door, this time more cautious. When I opened it, I saw nothing again, only the dark woods stretching out in every direction. But then, something caught my eye. Just past the edge of the porch, there was a figure standing in the trees. It was difficult to make out at first, but there was definitely someone there. I squinted, my breath catching in my throat, but before I could call out, the figure disappeared into the shadows. My skin crawled. I quickly shut the door, locking it behind me. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as I backed away from the door, glancing nervously at the windows. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably some animal, or maybe even my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I could feel it. I spent the rest of the night on edge, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The sounds of the night seemed to grow louder, every twig snapping and leaf rustling sending a wave of dread through me. I eventually fell asleep, but it was fitful and restless. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. I tried to convince myself that it was just my nerves getting the best of me, that I was just spooked by the isolation. I went about my day, determined to shake off the weird experience from the night before. But as the day wore on, I noticed something that made my stomach churn: the footprints. Outside, near the edge of the porch, there were footprints in the dirt. They were large, muddy prints, barefoot, human-sized. I crouched down to get a closer look, my heart pounding in my chest. The footprints weren't fresh, they looked old, like they had been there for a while. But the more I looked at them, the more I realized they hadn't been there when I first arrived. I quickly stood up and scanned the area around me. There was no one in sight. The woods were still, the air thick with silence. But something felt off. I could sense a presence nearby, like I wasn't alone. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a person had walked by without me noticing. But deep down, I knew the truth. That night, I didn't want to stay in the cabin, but I had no choice. I couldn't drive out in the dark, and it wasn't safe to walk to the nearest town. So I stayed. I locked all the doors and windows, and I made sure the fireplace was burning brightly. I set up a chair near the door, just in case. But as the night wore on, the knocking started again. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing minute. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the back of the cabin now, from the window. I hesitated, my hands trembling as I reached for the curtains. I pulled them back just enough to look outside. Nothing. But then I saw it, a shadow, moving across the ground near the edge of the woods. It was dark, shifting in and out of view. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively stepped back, nearly knocking over a lamp. I tried to rationalize it again. It could be an animal, a deer, or the wind moving a branch. But this felt different. It felt deliberate. And it felt close. I went to the door, heart racing, and opened it just enough to peek outside. Nothing. Just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I quickly closed it, locking it once more, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I felt the weight of something pressing down on me, something ancient and unexplainable. The whispers started next. They were faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind, but as the night deepened, they grew clearer. "Help me," a voice murmured. "Help me." The words repeated, coming from all around me as if they were drifting in from the trees themselves. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, and my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest help. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Help me," they pleaded. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to drive back to the town and find safety. But something kept me there, frozen in place. It was like the cabin itself was holding me captive, forcing me to listen. Eventually the night passed and the whispers stopped. The knocking ceased, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night staring at the walls, listening to the silence. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. Something was here with me. Something that didn't belong in this world. Something that was waiting for me to leave, to follow me. And I knew, without a doubt, that if I stayed, it would get worse. The next morning, I packed up my things in a hurry, not caring if I left behind anything. I didn't want to be there a moment longer than necessary. I drove as fast as I could, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone behind me. I made it to the nearest town without incident, but the experience stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind carried whispers I couldn't understand. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. The middle of nowhere wasn't empty. It was waiting. Story the end.
Story number 18.
It was the middle of the night when I found myself driving through the desolate stretch of highway that cut through miles of nothing. I had been on the road for hours, the only company being the low hum of my car's engine and the occasional flicker of a signpost passing by. I was on my way to a small town far from anything familiar, a quiet getaway where I hoped to escape the stress of city life. But as the night wore on, I began to feel the creeping sense that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like ages, and the GPS on my phone was of no use, cutting out the moment I left the last town behind. The fog had started rolling in around me, thick and suffocating. The darkness was absolute. The road felt endless, winding and isolated. The only sound was the tires on the wet asphalt, a rhythmic noise that seemed to match my growing unease. That's when I saw it, a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the kind of vision you get when you've been driving for too long. But as I got closer, it became clearer. A man, standing on the side of the road. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. The fog seemed to swallow him whole, making it difficult to distinguish any more details. I slowed down, unsure if I should stop. I had heard stories about hitchhikers and strange figures on roads like this, but something inside me told me to at least check. Maybe he needed help. Maybe his car had broken down. I rolled down the window and called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" There was no answer. I stopped the car, my heart racing a little. I couldn't see his face, couldn't get a clear look at him. The man remained perfectly still, not moving an inch. The longer I stared, the more uncomfortable I felt. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I hesitated, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. But when I looked back toward him, he was gone, just like that, vanished into the thick fog without a trace. I quickly rolled up the window, my pulse racing. I started driving again, trying to shake off the unease settling deep in my stomach. I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that I had been tired and overthinking things. But I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. For miles, the road remained empty. The fog grew denser, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I could barely make out the dark outline of the trees that lined the road, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that made your thoughts feel too loud. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw something in the distance. A shape. It was blurry at first, but as I got closer, I could make out the figure standing on the side of the road again. The same man. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way he could have walked that far in such a short amount of time. I hadn't passed any side roads. He couldn't have gotten ahead of me. Yet, there he was, standing in the same spot, unmoving, just staring at me. I slowed down, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. I called out again, my voice shaky. "Hey, are you all right?" This time there was no response. He didn't even acknowledge me. His stillness was unnerving, and I felt an overwhelming urge to get away. I stepped on the gas and sped past him, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. But this time, I didn't see him disappear into the fog like before. No, this time, he was following me. I could see his figure moving slowly behind my car, keeping pace with me as I drove faster and faster. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get away. I drove faster, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal, the engine roaring in protest. But no matter how fast I went, no matter how many turns I took, the man kept up with me. His figure remained in the mirror, always a few steps behind. My mind raced, my thoughts muddled with panic. How is this possible? I couldn't make sense of it. I had to get out of there, to find a place where I could stop and figure out what was going on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light in the distance. A gas station. I took the next turn and pulled in without a second thought, slamming the car into park. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat there for a few seconds, staring at the gas station lights, trying to collect myself. I didn't know if I should go inside or not. What if the man was still out there, just waiting for me? But I knew I couldn't stay in the car forever. I forced myself out of the car, my legs trembling beneath me as I walked to the door of the station. The bell above it chimed as I entered, and the attendant, an older man, looked up from the counter. "You all right?" he asked, his eyes flicking over me. He could tell something was wrong. I just need to use the bathroom," I muttered, trying to act normal, but my voice was unsteady. "And I need a drink, something to calm my nerves." He nodded, motioning toward the back. "Restroom's around the corner." I forced myself to take a deep breath, walking quickly to the restroom. But as I passed the front door, I couldn't help but glance outside. The fog had begun to lift slightly, and I could see the road stretching out before me. There was no sign of the man. I stayed in the bathroom longer than I needed to, trying to steady myself, trying to gather my thoughts. When I finally came out, I went to the counter, bought a bottle of water, and walked back outside. The man was gone. I got back in my car and left the station as quickly as I could, the uneasy feeling still hanging over me. I couldn't shake the image of the man, the way he had appeared twice on that empty stretch of road, and how he had followed me. I wasn't sure what had happened or what I had seen, but I was certain that whatever it wasn't just my imagination. I didn't stop again until I reached the town I was headed to, and when I finally pulled up to the small inn where I had planned to stay, I felt a strange relief. I was exhausted, but I didn't dare tell anyone about what had happened. And even now, whenever I'm on a lonely stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, wondering if I'll ever see that man again. Story the end.